The world sees the British monarchy as a fortress of tradition, a seamless line of succession built on the cold logic of duty. But behind the heavy oak doors of Sandringham, a final directive was issued, one that would push the heir to his absolute limit. This wasn't a routine administrative request or a debate over ceremonial roles. This was the moment King Charles III attempted to reshape the future of the firm, and in doing so, he struck a nerve so deep that Prince William, the loyal son and future king, chose to do the unthinkable. He said no. The tension had been simmering for months, masked by the carefully managed optics of royal engagements and hollow smiles for the cameras. But as Charles faced the reality of a modern monarchy under siege, hit by illness, internal leaks, and a crumbling public narrative, his private office drafted a document that was intended to be the ultimate safeguard for the crown. The directive, marked eyes only and signed with the king's own hand, demanded a radical restructuring of the inner circle. It was a plan designed to consolidate power at the top, a move that would effectively sideline the very people William had spent his entire life protecting. When the memo reached William's desk at Kensington Palace, the air in the room reportedly went cold. This wasn't just about politics. It was about the survival of his own family unit within the larger, often ruthless machinery of the palace. For years, William had operated as the perfect bridge between his father's vision and the modern reality he and Catherine represented. But this directive crossed a sacred line. It asked for a sacrifice that William was no longer willing to make. The palace machine, which had always prioritized the institution over the individual, had finally met its match in a prince who realized that the crown is worth nothing if it destroys the blood that sustains it. Insiders described the ensuing confrontation as electric. Charles, the man who waited 70 years for his turn to rule, believed his word was final. William, however, stood his ground with a steel spine that many say he inherited from the late Queen herself. "You are asking me to burn the future to save the present," William reportedly told his father in a voice that shook the very foundations of the room. This was the night the mask slipped, the night the perfect portrait of royal unity was shattered by a single, definitive act of defiance. The directive issued by King Charles was not born in a vacuum. It was the clinical product of a palace inner circle that had grown increasingly paranoid. For decades, the men in gray suits, the senior advisors and private secretaries, had operated under the mantra that the monarchy must remain an enigma, a distant and untouchable symbol. But William saw the world differently. He understood that in an age of instant transparency, silence isn't dignity. It's a vacuum that gets filled with toxic speculation. As Charles's health concerns became a central focus of the global press, the palace machine tightened its grip on information. The directive aimed to enforce a one-voice policy, effectively muzzling the Wales household and placing all communications under the direct control of Buckingham Palace. To the king's advisors, this was about streamlining the message. To William, it was an attempt to erase the autonomy of the future king and queen, turning them into mere pawns of a fading protocol. The tension reached a fever pitch during a private briefing at Clarence House. Sources claim that Charles's private office presented a strategy that would require Prince William to step back from certain high-profile international charities to avoid overshadowing the king's new initiatives. It was a calculated move to ensure that the spotlight remained firmly on the sovereign. William, however, saw the inherent danger. He knew that the only way for the crown to survive the 21st century was through the humanity and relatability that he and Kate had worked so hard to cultivate. "You are asking me to diminish the light of my family to cover the cracks in the institution," William reportedly countered. The room fell into a suffocating silence. This wasn't just a disagreement over a schedule. It was a fundamental clash of ideologies. Charles believed in the power of the office. William believed in the power of the people behind it. By refusing this directive, William didn't just challenge his father. He challenged a century-old system that viewed human vulnerability as a liability rather than an asset. The architects of silence had met their first true rebel, and the fractures within the palace walls were beginning to widen beyond repair. While the battle of wills raged between the king and his heir, the true emotional weight of the crisis was being felt at Adelaide Cottage. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, had always been the monarchy's most reliable stabilizer, the human face that bridged the gap between ancient ritual and modern empathy. But as she navigated her own health journey, she found herself at the center of the palace's cold strategic maneuvers. The king's directive didn't just seek to control William's schedule. It sought to manage Catherine's return to public life with a level of clinical precision that ignored the reality of her recovery. For Charles, the optic was everything. He needed a united, healthy-looking front to reassure a nervous nation. But for William, watching his wife endure the dual pressure of illness and institutional demands, the directive felt like an assault on their private peace. The palace had spent months trying to control reality itself, issuing vague statements while the public's trust eroded. Now they were asking William to sign off on a plan that would put Catherine back on the global stage before she was ready, all to serve a PR narrative designed in a boardroom at Buckingham Palace. William's refusal was fueled by a memory that still haunted the halls of the palace, the memory of how the institution had failed to protect the women within it in the past. He saw history threatening to repeat itself, where dignity was used as a shield to hide uncomfortable truths. Catherine's own 94-second video had already shattered the palace's polished script, offering a vulnerability that the machine could never replicate. By refusing Charles's final directive, William was making a choice. He was choosing his wife over the protocol, a move that the senior courtiers viewed as a dangerous precedent. The atmosphere at the palace was described as suffocatingly tense. Every missed phone call and every cancelled briefing was a signal of a family reaching its breaking point. William was no longer just a prince waiting for his turn. He was a husband and a father standing at a crossroads. The men in gray whispered that this was a constitutional crisis in the making, but to William, it was a test of survival. If the monarchy couldn't protect its own, how could it hope to lead a nation? The shadow at Adelaide Cottage had become a wall that no royal decree could climb. As the deadlock between King Charles and Prince William intensified, a third power began to move within the shadows of the palace. Princess Anne, long considered the backbone of the institution and the keeper of its most rigid secrets, could no longer remain a silent observer. Known for her unwavering loyalty to the crown, Anne's intervention was not expected to be a defense of William's rebellion, but rather a cold assessment of the damage being done to the family's legacy. She understood better than anyone that when the gears of the monarchy grind against each other, the entire structure risks a catastrophic failure. Behind the closed doors of the private apartments, Anne reportedly confronted Charles with a bluntness that only a sister could deliver. She saw that the king's directive was not just about streamlining power, but about a deep-seated fear of losing relevance in a world that was moving faster than the palace could manage. "You cannot lead a modern nation by treating your heir like a subordinate," she is said to have warned. Her ultimatum was clear. If the king did not find a way to compromise with William, the resulting fracture would be a self-inflicted wound from which the monarchy might never recover. However, the crisis was no longer contained within the family. Whispers began to leak from the very heart of the royal household, small, chilling fragments of information that suggested the unity of the firm was an illusion. Rumors of a confidential succession optics memo began to circulate among the London press, hinting that the king's inner circle was actively planning for a future that minimized the influence of the Wales household. These leaks weren't accidents. They were signals of an institution at war with itself, where privacy was being used as a weapon to control the narrative. For William, these leaks were the final proof that the palace machine was no longer a protector, but a threat. Every headline about his detachment or his refusal to cooperate felt like a calculated strike from within his father's own office. The trust that had held the family together for generations was being replaced by a cold, tactical suspicion. As Anne's warning echoed through the halls of Sandringham, the question was no longer about a single directive. It was about who truly owned the story of the crown. Just as the internal power struggle reached its peak, a new and more dangerous element entered the fray: the weaponization of health data. In the sterile corridors of the palace, information is the ultimate currency, and for those seeking to force William back into the one-voice policy, his wife's medical privacy became an unintended casualty. A confidential medical file, supposedly containing details about Catherine's long-term recovery and unexpected complications, began to be whispered about in senior courtier circles. These weren't just rumors. They were calculated leaks designed to create an aura of instability around the Wales household, suggesting that the future king was distracted and unfit to handle the crown's new, rigorous demands. When William discovered that details of Catherine's condition were being discussed in boardroom meetings he was excluded from, his reaction was a rare and alarming break from his usual composure. For a man who had seen how the palace machine had managed and failed his mother, this was a haunting echo of the past. The directive from Charles now carried a darker undertone. Cooperate, or we will manage the narrative for you. It was a cold, institutional ultimatum. William was being told that if he didn't surrender his autonomy, the palace would not protect the secrecy he so desperately craved for his recovering wife. The pressure culminated on a rainy evening at Windsor. William was reportedly presented with a contingency plan that outlined a future where his public role would be significantly increased to cover for the king's absence, while Catherine's image would be curated through pre-recorded, highly edited appearances. It was a plan that treated his wife like a digital asset rather than a human being. The king's advisors argued this was for the good of the institution, but to William, it was the ultimate betrayal of trust. He was being asked to choose between the survival of the monarchy and the survival of his wife's dignity. In that moment, the Prince of Wales made his stand. He didn't just refuse the directive. He threatened to step away entirely if the palace continued to treat his family's health as a PR pawn. The threat of a missing heir was the one thing the palace machine feared more than bad headlines. William had realized that the crown is a harmless fairy tale only until it starts demanding human sacrifices. As he left the meeting, he reportedly told a senior aide, "If the king wants a monarchy without a heart, he can have it, but he won't have me." The breaking point had been reached, and for the first time in centuries, the heir was ready to walk away to save the woman he loved. The air in the king's private study at Buckingham Palace was thick with the weight of centuries, but the silence between Charles and William was a modern, clinical kind of cold. Following William's threat to step away, the palace machine had gone into a state of panic management. Charles, a man who had spent his entire life preparing for the crown, could not understand a son who would risk the institution for personal humanity. This wasn't just a clash of wills. It was a fundamental failure of the palace script, where the sovereign's directive was no longer an absolute command, but a subject of negotiation. Charles reportedly attempted to appeal to William's sense of legacy, reminding him that the crown's stability depended on a flawless, united front. But William, fueled by the memory of the truth dragged out at the last possible moment regarding Catherine's illness, refused to blink. He saw that the king's directive was a mask to hide the systemic fragility of a monarchy that was more afraid of truth than of scandal. To William, the palace's obsession with optics first had become a trap that threatened to destroy the emotional center of his family. In a move described as surgical, the palace attempted one last time to force a reconciliation photo, a curated image of Charles and William standing side by side to signal that everything was under control. William's refusal was a turning point that shook the monarchy to its core. He knew that a fake photo would only feed the crisis of trust that had been brewing for months. By standing his ground, William was effectively telling the palace machine that he would no longer manage reality to suit a polished royal narrative. The king's advisors were reportedly stunned into silence, realizing that the future king was no longer playing by the old rules. The system had reached its breaking point. Charles was left standing in the shadow of a throne that felt increasingly isolated, while William chose to return to the bedside of a woman whose honest vulnerability was more powerful than any royal decree. This was the night the crown finally had to admit it could bleed, and that the one person who humanized the institution was the one they had almost lost to secrecy. While William was trapped in this constitutional deadlock, Catherine realized that the palace's prolonged silence was no longer a shield. It had become a black hole, consuming the public's trust. The term privacy had been weaponized by the institution to delay uncomfortable truths, effectively isolating the Wales family from the very people who supported them. Facing the cold wall of King Charles's final protocol, Kate made a definitive choice to push back the right way. She decided to own her story. This decision was a direct strike against the palace machine that sought to control reality itself. Kate refused to use the polished, soulless press releases issued by the king's office. Instead, she chose a simple wooden bench, a natural setting, and a 94-second video message to speak directly about her cancer diagnosis. This wasn't just a medical update. It was a strategic act of breaking the royal script to reestablish a human-to-human connection. By appearing in a state of fragile yet honest vulnerability, she stripped the senior courtiers of their most powerful weapon: secrecy. Kate's intervention forced a turning point that left even King Charles stunned. While the palace wanted to manage optics, Kate offered honest vulnerability, something the system was never designed to handle. She wasn't just fighting for her life. She was fighting to protect William from the crushing weight of institutional directives. The video sent an unspoken message to Buckingham Palace. The Wales family would no longer allow the machinery of the crown to grind down their humanity. Those 94 seconds proved a chilling reality for the architects of power. When a monarchy survives solely by humanizing the regime, every illness becomes a test of the institution's survival. Kate didn't just update her medical status. She rewrote the laws of royal engagement. Her honesty was the savior of the crown's collapsing reputation, but it was also a final declaration that the era of palace secrets had reached its end. The global resonance of Kate's 94-second video acted as a breaking point for the king's senior advisors. The architects of silence within Buckingham Palace suddenly found themselves in an untenable position. Their strategy of optics first had been exposed as a failure of institutional empathy. By bypassing the official palace press machine, Kate didn't just share her health status. She effectively dismantled the authority of the king's final directive. The men in gray were forced to confront a chilling reality. The future of the monarchy now rested on the honest vulnerability they had spent months trying to suppress. Inside the palace, the atmosphere shifted from tactical control to damage limitation. Charles, seeing the massive outpouring of public support for Kate's transparency, realized that his directive had pushed the air too far. The leaks and fights behind closed doors had led to a crisis of trust that threatened to fracture the line of succession permanently. It was reported that Charles personally called for a meeting of his closest aides to reset the script, effectively acknowledging that the old protocol was no longer survivable in the face of human vulnerability. William, however, remained withdrawn. He had witnessed the palace machine manage reality at the cost of his family's peace, and he was no longer interested in curated reconciliations. The king's final attempt at a diplomatic olive branch was met with the same steel spine William had shown from the start. He made it clear that any future cooperation would be on his terms, prioritizing the humanity of the Wales household over the rigid demands of the institution. The crown had reached a moment where it was forced to admit it could bleed, and the king had to accept that his heir would no longer be ruled by the shadows of the past. In the aftermath of the collision between the king's directive and William's defiance, a new, unspoken set of rules began to govern the British monarchy. The palace machine, once an immovable force of protocol, had been forced into a humiliating retreat. This wasn't just a family reconciliation. It was a fundamental shift in the institutional protocol. The king had to accept a fragile future where the health and survival of the Wales household would never again be sacrificed for a polished royal narrative. Kate had successfully reset the monarchy's script, proving that honest vulnerability was a more potent currency than royal mystery. For William, this victory came with a heavy price. He had proved that he was willing to step away to protect his family, a move that forever changed the power dynamics between the king and the heir. The palace was now forced to develop new contingency plans, acknowledging that health is not optional background noise, but a central factor in the survival of the crown. The monarchy had to admit it was mortal, shifting from an image of being invulnerable to one that was intensely human. This shift wasn't just about PR. It was about the very structure of the institution. The king's inner circle was effectively dismantled, replaced by a reset that prioritized humanity over optics. Charles realized that his son was no longer just a prince in waiting, but a man who had successfully challenged the entire palace machine to protect the woman who held the emotional center of the monarchy. The breaking point had birthed a new era where duty no longer meant the erasure of the individual. As the dust settled, the world watched a system reach its limit and finally admit that even behind gilded walls, the crown must have a heart to survive. The crisis sparked by King Charles's final directive and Prince William's unprecedented defiance has left the British monarchy forever changed. This wasn't just a fleeting family drama. It was a fundamental test of survival for an ancient institution forced to confront its own human vulnerability in real time. The breaking point between the king and his heir proved that the crown can no longer survive behind a mask of secrecy and polished royal narratives. By choosing his family over the palace machine, William essentially rewrote the monarchy's script, signaling that the era of sacrificing human dignity for the sake of optics is officially over. The legacy of this confrontation is a monarchy that has finally been forced to admit it can bleed. Kate's decision to offer honest vulnerability instead of a clinical palace statement became the turning point that humanized the regime, even as it exposed the failures of the institutional protocol. The palace has had to adjust its very foundation, implementing new protocols and contingency plans that acknowledge the mortality and the private needs of those who wear the crown. No longer is health considered background noise. It is now recognized as a central factor in the crown's ability to lead a 21st century nation. As we look toward the future, the message from Kensington Palace is clear. The monarchy doesn't just manage feelings. It must now manage reality with transparency and heart. The missing heir and the missing princess were not accidents of fate, but the results of a system that tried to control truth until it reached a breaking point. If the monarchy wants to survive in a world that watched Kate suffer, it cannot go back to pretending that nothing ever breaks behind palace walls. This was the moment the fairy tale ended and the real, fragile work of modern leadership began.